All right. Well, here we go. So, Josh Singer, there's a million different reasons that somebody would want to tell the story of Neil Armstrong on the big screen. But as a screenwriter, what specifically attracted you to his story? What made you want to be a part of this?
I would say there were a couple things. First of all, it's good to be here. Always nice to have a good reason to be here. The first was Damien. I had just seen Whiplash. It had been at Sundance. It still wasn't out in theaters. They smuggled me a DVD under lock and key, and I was blown away. I mean, I think it's hard not to be blown away by Damien's talent and his, the way he makes theatrical experiences. And so I knew that if I could get the story right, he would do that with this. And he was very taken with telling the story that's never been told before about how challenging it was to achieve this difficult achievement. And when I started reading Jim Henson's book after I got through all the technical stuff, which was at times tough to get through. Once I got into the meat of Neil's life and what his human experience had been, I was struck by how much loss and pain there had been, and I really wanted to pay tribute to that, because I think in some ways it is incredibly informative to us as we face great challenges to look frankly at what it takes to achieve and to meet those challenges. And it ain't easy.
You mentioned the loss in his life. I wonder if you could talk a bit more about, finding the man that's underneath all of the myth of Neil Armstrong.
Yeah, it's not easy, I gotta say. People have remarked that the character is somewhat distant, somewhat remote. When people say that, I think, well, we've done our job. That's how he was. Rick, his son, will tell you that, oftentimes you'd ask him a question, he just wouldn't respond. Janet would say, no from Neil was a full argument. This was not. This was a fairly emotionally tightly packaged guy, and I think if you look at what happened to him, you can understand why. I mean, I've got a 2-year-old now. The idea of anything happening to him is I don't know how I would go on. So if that's your original sin, right? And it's not really, because Neil had lost buddies in Korea. And certainly there were test pilots who died while he was working at Edwards. But, to lose a daughter like that, who's at such a young age, and to have to put that aside and keep going, which is what he did, because that's what you did back then. If someone passed, you put aside the pain and threw yourself into your work. And so for that to happen, and then for him to lose his closest colleague in the Gemini program, Elliot C., randomly, literally, Elliot crashed, his T-38 into a building, which was, a freak plane crash, right? And these guys generally didn't crash their planes. So it was very upsetting, I think, to all of them. Any number of astronauts I talked to at this late date would say, yeah, Elliot killed my buddy Charlie Bassett, who was, riding behind him in the T-38. But for Neil to, who had been training with Elliot for months and months and months, and he and Elliot were really peas in a pod. They were both sort of fairly cerebral types who had both been civilians before joining the program. I think that was, and then 2 weeks later he has to go up in Gemini 8, right, where he almost dies. And then within a 12-month period, he loses his next door neighbor, who's his other closest friend. Again, like, you see loss after loss, and what is one to do if one wants to stay the course, and it's, you know, push it down and compartmentalize, and as a result become more distant, right? And it puts you into this place where you just keep running and running from grief. And, you know, it's hard to watch. And it must have been even harder to live. And I think that not only did Neil sacrifice tremendously in order to keep going, but his whole family did. And we really try to show, you know, and I think all these families did sacrifice a great amount in order to support, you know, the astronauts in this program.
Right. I mean, I guess it deals with emotion in a different kind of way, which makes the payoff at the end all the more powerful.
Yeah, I mean, there's some folks, you know, it's funny. The movie is there is a plan to the movie, right? So the movie can be in some ways very frustrating until you get to that end. But this is the way it was, right? We're taking as little license as possible. We're telling a history, and it's because that history has been, I think, in many ways misrepresented, that we felt an even more, an even larger compunction to get it right. I had a friend who's a writer, who's one of my favorite writers in the business, actually, who I work with on Fringe, and he was in the military. And he came up to me after he saw the movie and clearly had liked it quite a bit. And I got the sense that, you know, yeah, this is how it is for these guys, right? And, you know, and that's what we're trying to get across here. So, you know, it's funny, we felt such a compunction to get it right that I've got a little prop here. So, and I don't know if this has been done, but so what we did is we created an annotated screenplay here. This is for sale on Amazon. Or if you come up to me and you're nice to me, I might just give you one. So what we've got is we've got the script, and then next to the script we have commentary by Jim Hansen, who wrote the biography, and myself. And in this commentary, and also there are some lovely pictures, but in this commentary, what we do is we talk about every scene and discuss how we, you know, give historical context to every scene, because, you know, you can't cram it all into the movie. But also we talk about where we took license, you know, and every time I took license, I was in discussions with Jim, you know, you know, and we do that because we want to be very transparent about the choices we're making, and also make it clear that we're not taking much license at all. Because, you know, there was some concern that people would accuse us of taking a lot more license given the portrait of Neil, and given that the portrait of Neil is unlike anything anyone has seen before. But we actually were very, very careful. You know, a good example, which I talk about in the book, you know, when Neil finds out about Apollo 1, you know, Damien and my first instinct, the dramatic instinct, was to have him lose it. Right, because we've been so contained for so long. And the first thing I wrote, you know, Damien and I talked about it, and we had this scene where he literally takes the phone and hears the information, doesn't react, and then starts slamming the phone down on the receiver and beating it until his hand is bloody and until he breaks the phone, and a full aria, if you will, of emotion. And we sent it off to Jim Hansen, the biographer, and to the Sons, and everyone was like, "That's not Neil. He never would have done that, never in a million years." And so then I'm stuck with the situation of, okay, you know, so they're telling me that he would have contained that reaction. So how do we get that across? And so I came up with this idea of the glass, where he's on the phone, he gets the information, he's got a glass in his hands, and then you see the light go out of his eyes. And the good news is I knew we'd have a great actor like Ryan who would, you know, be able to do something like that. And of course, I think it's a beautiful performance in that moment. But, you know, he puts the phone down and then you hear a pop, and he looks down and he's broken the glass in his hands because he was squeezing it so tightly. And that one I got past the goalie. I got past Jim and the boys, and they said, okay, that feels like, I'm not sure that would have happened, but but it doesn't feel totally out of character. And so we were very, very careful. And so we're trying to do as realistic a portrait as possible here.
It's interesting how you can arrive at something like that. Going off of that, was it difficult to distill the story? I mean, so much happens in such a long period of time. Was it difficult to decide what to leave out in a lot of instances to kind of keep that focus narrowly on Neil's personal journey?
Yeah, yes and no. So it wasn't difficult to distill in that we were, from the very beginning, we knew this was a story about Neil and not a story about, not a larger story. And while we were going to meet certain people on the way, we were always going to be through that lens of Neil. And the main sort of insight, which Damien and I came to very early on, was to open on the X-15. And it was, I won't say it was obvious, but it always very quickly felt like the right choice. First of all, greatest set piece in the world. Second of all, most people don't know that Neil flew this plane. In fact, most people don't know this plane existed, and yet it's the fastest aircraft we've ever built and the highest flying aircraft we ever built. And so just showing that, that aircraft in flight felt like a really exciting way to begin. And not to mention, Neil screws up, and how surprising is it to see, one of the greatest aviators of all time screw up, and moreover screw up for an emotional reason, because he's got a sick kid at home. Again, something that's unexpected and surprising. And so, it was very clearly, okay, this is where we want to begin. Moreover, there was some conjecture that, one of the reasons Neil, threw himself, towards Project Gemini is because he was having some issues at Edwards and because of the loss of his daughter and needing to change scenery. So it just felt like a great, opening. And once we had that as our opening, Gemini 8, well, that's clearly the midpoint, his other flight, and it's such an amazing, harrowing adventure. And then obviously the moon was going to be where we ended things. I think that what was challenging in terms of distillation, was really the technical stuff, within each of those missions, right? How do we get across everything we want to, and how do we make it clear and dramatic? The Apollo 11 transcript there are 2 of them, and each one is like 600 pages long. Right. And figuring out, okay, if we want to be accurate, so we want to use actual comms, like which comms do you use and how do you find your way in terms of what are the important moments on that trip to the moon, which, by the way, we're not going to cover very much at all because it was fairly uneventful. Right. The landing was incredibly eventful. And so we're going to be in great detail there. But even there, like, how are we going to highlight the key moments, which were quite harrowing, and yet also convey the general progression. And that was just immensely challenging with the landing, the Apollo journey as a whole, Gemini, X-15, getting these sequences right to the point that they were both technically accurate, but also dramatic and clear to the audience, was a huge challenge. And, I literally could not have done that without tremendous help from, Jim Hansen himself, and then incredible tech advisors who put me in touch with, Gene Matranga, who was an engineer who worked with Neil on the X-15 program, Joe Engel, who's the last living X-15 pilot, who walked me through that flight several times and gave me notes on 3 or 4 passes of the script. Frank Hughes, who left NASA as head of astronaut training, who knew the Gemini and the Apollo crafts backwards and forwards, and who was able to walk me through those missions, read multiple drafts of the script. In addition to Mike Collins and Buzz Aldrin, who read scripts and saw the cut and gave us notes. In addition to, there were, the list goes on and on, and then on the personal front, obviously Mark, Rick, and Janet, but, the technical distillation was in terms of distillation, that was the huge challenge.
Well, going off of that, I did want to ask you about the rather silly controversy you guys had when it premiered at Venice, I think, about the planting of the American flag, which is rather silly considering when you watch the movie, it's there in a very beautiful shot. So I guess I just wanted to get your opinion or explanation or whatever that was about that.
Yeah, I mean, look, I would say that it's a shame, right? Because I think that we've now been hit by the right and the left, right? The right are upset that we don't have the planting of the American flag, and the left are upset. Why are we doing another great white man of history story? And oddly, I think the answer to both of them is the same: is that we're doing a history, right? And we're trying to look very specifically at the history and at and not color it, one way or another. And it's funny, Jim Hansen did most of the research on the computers who were featured in Hidden Figures, and so can talk to them, can talk about that ad infinitum, and will. This was a different moment, and I think there are things that you learn by looking back at a history like this with such detail, that if you pay attention to it, teach us about our own time. To me, it's not a great man of history story. It's a ordinary family story about an ordinary family struggling to deal with this extraordinary mission. And in that, I think we show them clearly as an American family. There are flags all around. I think, the movie is patriotic. One might even say that, I guess there's been talk in recent years about how to make America great again. I don't tend to buy into the rhetoric that is being espoused by the people who talk about it. I think this is the way to make America great again, which is to realize that it wasn't easy. It's not like you snap your fingers. It's not about, the country suddenly giving to you and going back to this sort of beautiful depiction of, the way things were. These people worked hard and they sacrificed and they gave of themselves and they dealt with loss. And that's what we're trying to get across here, which is that, Neil and Janet, were heroes, and they were heroes, because of what they gave. And I think if we could get beyond our identity politics, both on the right and the left, and just look at this, for what it is, which is a history, and a history researched and written and shot with incredible care. Again, I wrote the book because I wanted to be very transparent about the couple little places we did take license. I think if you look clearly at the history, it's incredibly educational, and it teaches us that, like, if we are to take on the great challenges facing our country and our civilization, things as varied as income inequality and climate change, we're going to have to pony up. We're going to have to sacrifice and give of ourselves the way Neil and Janet did, the way Mark and Rick did, without even knowing that they were. I think only if we follow their lead, will we find a way to move forward into the future.
Yeah. Well, Josh Singer, it's always a pleasure talking with you. Thank you so much for your time, and congratulations on another very powerful movie about the very best of Americans, be them journalists or astronauts. You've carved out a nice little niche for yourself, making movies about heroic individuals.
Thanks very much. Nice to be on the show.
Thank you. Have a good one.
You too.
Thank you.